Good day, everyone. Welcome to English 102, Topic 7, Movement Theory and Minimalist Program. So, I am Mary Joy Amagdato, and you may simply call me Ma'am Joy. So, for today's discussion, I will be discussing one of the grammatical theories under generative grammar developed by Noam Chomsky, which is the movement theory, while the minimalist program will be discussed by my partner. So, do you know that before Chomsky developed the minimalist program, he introduced several theories explaining how sentences are formed? And one of those theories is the movement theory, which explains how words or phrases change their position within a sentence while preserving the intended meaning. So by the end of this discussion, I hope everyone will be able to understand why movement occurs and how it helps explain the English sentence structure. So before we begin, let us first look at our objectives. At the end of the lesson, you should be able to first define movement theory and explain why movement occurs in sentence structures. Second, construct a movement analysis of given sentences using the principles of movement theory. And third, demonstrate appreciation for the importance of movement theory in understanding English syntax through active participation in class discussions and learning activities. So these objectives will guide us throughout our discussion. So before we formally discuss movement theory, let's begin with the short activity called Spot the Change. So for the directions, as you can see, there are two pairs of sentences, and you have to carefully compare each pair and answer the following questions. So you have to identify which word or phrase changed its position and discuss why you think it moved. You will have 2 to 3 minutes to do this simple activity and be ready to share your answer with the class. Alright, time is up. So let's hear your observations. So for pair 1, which word changed its position? Alright, the word who. Then where was it originally located? Yes, at the end of the sentence. And where is it now? Of course, it's located at the beginning of the sentence. So let's look at pair number 2. So what have you noticed? What changed? Yes, the verb is moved before John. Alright, so notice that in both examples, the meaning of the sentence did not really change. However, the position of certain words changed in order to form a grammatical or correct question. So let's now dive deeper into movement theory. As I mentioned earlier, movement theory is one of the theories under generative grammar introduced by Noam Chomsky. So before we continue, here's a quick trivia. Did you know that Noam Chomsky is often called the father of modern linguistics? He earned this title because his theories transformed the way linguists understand how language and grammar work. Now, what exactly is movement theory? So it explains that certain elements in a sentence can change their position while keeping the same grammatical role and meaning. So in other words, the meaning of the word or phrase does not change. Only its position in the sentence changes. However, it's important to remember that this movement is not random. Words and phrases cannot simply be moved anywhere we want. Instead, they move according to grammatical rules that make a sentence correct and acceptable in English. So now let's look at these two sentences. For the statement, John will eat the apple. And the question will be, what will John eat? Notice that the word what originally comes from the object position, John will eat what, but it moves to the beginning of the sentence to form a question. So as you can see, the meaning stays the same, only the position of the word changes, and this is what movement theory explains. And at this point, you might be wondering, why don't we just memorize every sentence in English? According to movement theory, we don't have to memorize millions of possible sentences. Instead, our brains use grammatical rules to create and understand new sentences. That's why we can produce and comprehend sentences we've never heard before. And rather than storing every sentence in memory, our minds apply these rules to generate an unlimited number of grammatically correct sentences. And now that we understand what movement theory is, let's look at its four key concepts. We have deep structure, surface structure, movement, and trace. So first, let's talk about deep structure. It refers to the underlying meaning or the original arrangement of a sentence before any movement takes place. For example, look at this sentence. You saw who? In movement theory, this is considered the deep structure because the word who is still in its original position as the object of the verb saw. Next is the surface structure. It is the final form of the sentence, the one we actually speak or write. So using the same example, the surface structure is who did you see? Notice that the meaning is still the same. We are still asking about the person that was seen. The only difference is that the word who has moved to the beginning of the sentence to follow English grammar rules. So now let's move on to movement. It is the grammatical process in which a word or phrase changes its position in a sentence. So in our example, the word who moves from the end of the sentence to the beginning to form a grammatically correct WH question. And finally, let's discuss trace. So linguists believe that when an element moves, it leaves behind an invisible trace, represented by the symbol T. So who did you see? Linguists represent it as such as the one you see on the screen. So the small t marks the original position of the word who. Although we cannot hear or see this trace when speaking, it helps linguists explain where the word came from and how the sentence was formed through movement. So to summarize, deep structure shows the original arrangement, surface structure shows the final sentence we speak, movement is the process of changing the position of a word or phrase, and trace marks the original position left behind after the movement. So now that we understand the basic concepts of movement theory, let's explore the three common types of movement. Number one, WH movement. So this is the most common type of movement in English. This happens when WH words such as what, where, who, and why move to the beginning of a sentence to form a question. So let's take a look at this example. You bought what? After movement, it becomes what did you buy? So the word what moves from the end of the sentence to the beginning, and this is why it is called WH movement. So now let's proceed to the second type, which is called NP movement, which stands for noun phrase movement. So it's a group of words centered around a noun such as the suspect, the teacher, or my sister, and etc. So here, the noun phrase moves from one position to another, usually when changing an active sentence into a passive sentence. So for example, the police arrested the suspect. So after movement, it becomes the suspect was arrested by the police. So notice that the noun phrase, the suspect, moved from the object position to the subject position. So even though its position changed, the meaning of the sentence remained the same. So the third type is called head movement. In this type of movement, the auxiliary verb moves before the subject to form a question. So for example, she can swim. And after movement, it becomes, can she swim? So here, the auxiliary verb can moved from its original position to the beginning of the sentence before the subject she. So this movement helps us form a yes or no question. And now that we have learned the different types of movement, let's answer one final question. Why is movement theory important? So this is important because it explains how many English sentence patterns are formed. So instead of treating every sentence as different, it shows that questions, passive sentences, and other sentence structures are connected through grammatical movement. So it only shows that language is systematic and rule-governed, allowing us to create and understand countless sentences without memorizing each one. So overall, movement theory gives us a deeper understanding of how English grammar works and became the foundation for later theories, so including the minimalist program, which will be discussed by my partner. So with that being said, we have reached the end of my discussion. Once again, this is Mary Joy M. Magdatsu, or you can call me Ma'am Joy. Thank you so much for listening.